Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Gallagher. I am this relatively new director of the Sustainable Communities Program with BNRC. And I just want to thank you all so much for being here. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited to be moving some of this work forward, hopefully with the help of you all. So we can jump into it, and I'll just say at the forefront. If you are a member of or a follower of the NRC, some of this material that we're going to cover today might be a little bit of a refresher, but we do want to talk more specifically about smart growth in light of the climate crisis, which is something that wasn't so much of a direct connection when smart growth as a topic was kind of first brought into the conversation a couple decades ago. But it really does connect in a lot of different ways, and so we're gonna dive into that today. So today's agenda, first, just a quick background on what smart growth is, what it means when we say smart growth, why it's important for climate resilience, and then we're going to open up the conversation a bit more to talk about how we can achieve progress. So John and I are going to go a little bit back and forth talking about some of the policy and actions that we're looking towards this year, but we'd also really love to hear any questions or thoughts from you all. So if you're able to type them into the chat box, we'll add them in into the conversation. So first, I just want to make sure we're on the same page about what we mean when we talk about smart growth. So there's a lot of different similar ways to define it, but very broadly speaking, it's shorthand for development or planning strategies that revitalize neighborhoods, protects farmland and open space and natural resources. It can help to keep housing affordable and for different types of housing needs, and it provides more transportation options. So in the images that you can see up top here, we have a neighborhood in the south end of Burlington that I used to live in, Lakeside, which is a really fantastic place to live and was created as this walkable community next to an employer that originally had a shop, and there's a park and so on. So a really great example of what this can look like. And we'll talk about more about some of these other images in a second. But ultimately, smart growth can help us lead to some really important outcomes. And those are economically prosperous communities, those that are socially equitable, so thinking about all different needs of different people, and communities that are environmentally sustainable. So what goes into this? What are the kind of ingredients of smart growth? There are 10 principles that we all generally use across the country. These were developed by the National Smart Growth America organization. The first is a mix of uses. So this is, we want housing, stores, businesses, offices to be in the same place. This could look something like what we have in the picture down to the left here, where you might have commercial storefronts on the bottom and apartments up top, but it might also be a neighborhood generally of single family homes and a corner store that has your market and maybe some offices up top. The second is compact design. So this involves making more efficient use of our land that has already been developed. So instead of continuing to develop down the street or out into the field, we can build in infill and redevelop properties that we already have, and again continue to build in more densely in the areas that we've already developed. The third is having a range of housing opportunities and choices, and again this is looking at different needs for different people. Some people would like to live in a single family home with lots of land. Some people want to live in an apartment and don't want to have all the responsibilities that come with a larger home. Having human scale walkable neighborhoods. So developing our communities for people instead of just vehicles is a really critical part of what makes our communities livable and enjoyable and increasing our quality of life. And there's a lot of benefits that come with this particular point. And part of this, I think, contributes to a distinct sense of place. So this can happen through good design, both through a design of a building, and the building on the left here, we have some really beautiful architectural details, but it might also be something as like the design of a building in its relationship to the street. So having buildings, as you see here, that are along the street frontage, as opposed to having a large parking lot in front, is one component of that. The sixth principle is protecting farm and forest land. And this is something at BNRC that we talk about a lot as being really critical to be part of the conversation. When we talk about smart growth, it's both developing in the places that we want, and that means also at the same time trying to protect those more ecologically sensitive areas. And we need to talk about both and do both at the same time. So that means directing development to our existing communities to make better use of the infrastructure that we already have. And this is good for several reasons, but thinking also about the economic health of municipalities. This is something that can help economically as well as environmentally, as we just mentioned, and socially. So developing more densely in a smart growth way can also provide greater transportation options. That can look like greater public transit, as we see here in the bottom right, but also having greater capacity to have active transportation options for people as we look at new technological advances that we have in the transportation realm, such as there's different pilot projects for different types of transit solutions happening across the state. And those things all are made more possible when we have more people living in villages and towns. So number 9 is making our development decisions as predictable and fair and cost effective as possible. Of course, we would all like to achieve that goal. And similarly, it's a process that encourages community development and stakeholder collaboration in its development decisions. And this is, going back to point number 4, making our communities built for people. You need to involve the people who live there to actually inform what the needs are and the wants and the vision of that community to actually make it have the results that they are looking for and that they're seeking. So Vermont has really been a leader in smart growth for several decades. Vermont statute includes a definition of smart growth that includes a lot of these elements already. So we, I just want to note that there's been a lot of work that has gone into this, and we are in a pretty good spot. And this is why I think Vermont is the incredible place that it is today. We have thinking about smart growth and policies that have been put in place, and such as Act 250 and others. That is why we have our existing historic compact villages and towns. And a lot of work has gone into that. So I just want to note that a lot of work has already been done, but clearly we know that a lot more needs to happen as well. So if we do develop in line with these policies and principles, what does smart growth get us? I've mentioned a couple things already, like transportation choices. So you can feel good about sending your kids out on their bikes down the street. It can provide a greater variety of housing choices, so not just large homes in the countryside, but we have apartments and duplexes and so on. We have communities that have a strong sense of place, that are appealing and welcoming, but there's a lot of other benefits as well. It makes communities more walkable, which provides more convenient access to things that people need. And this is really important for older adults in particular. But also as we think about younger families and younger adults, we know that there's an increasing trend of folks who want to live closer to services and more, downtown opportunities where things are going on and things are a little bit more happening. Multiple transportation options also mean that people can spend less money on fuel and on vehicles, which are very expensive. And they can, if you are getting out of your car, you are going to be generating fewer greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll talk about that more in a second when we talk more about the climate aspect. But this is also a health issue. Less cars, less pollution. Other public health benefits, getting from walking and biking, but also well-designed communities can provide people greater access to healthy food, and things like social connectedness, which I'll talk about more in a second, but I think it's really important just, coming out of and still being in the middle of a pandemic where I think it was really highlighted the impact, especially in our more rural communities, that isolation can have on folks. And if they are separated from both health services and food and people, that can have a really significant toll, physical health and mental health. And so it's just something to be aware of in our community design. And another point that I want to touch on, but not dwell on for too long, is this other side of smart growth, which is sprawl, or poorly planned or unplanned growth and development. We know that the kind of catalysts for environmental planning and good zoning in Vermont started back in about the 60s when we started to face major population shifts. We had the arrival of the interstate. The environmental movement was happening around the same time as well. And that ended up, again, in a lot of these really impactful policies that have gotten us to a pretty good place today. But now we are facing pretty significant changes. Again, we have a changing climate. We have technological shifts, demographic shifts that I think, again, we just saw really kind of sped up by the pandemic. And so we've already seen kind of kick off a new wave of migration into the state of Vermont. And so when we talk about smart growth, the NRC often stresses the importance of developing in the right places and protecting natural resources, again, in tandem, making sure that we're doing both at the same time. But I think that this new urgency that we're facing from climate change and COVID migration has really reinforced that importance of discouraging poorly planned development in places that we don't want. So I just want to note that, I think when we talk about smart growth, it can be kind of a head nodder and like, yeah, of course we want like well-designed communities and walkable towns are fantastic. And yeah, like, right. But it's worth remembering what can happen and what has happened as a result of poorly planned development. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more about the specific climate benefits of smart growth. And these, again, overlap a pretty good amount with the general benefits that we see from smart growth. But just to put a finer point on it, start with natural resources. Again, we can use smart growth to guide development in a way that protects our forests and wildlife, that increases potential for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services. We can allow for our rivers to flow freely in the way that they want, but also making sure to protect our nearby homes and infrastructure. From an affordable housing perspective, and when I say affordable housing, I mean affordable for everybody. We can accommodate current and future Vermonters and their need for affordable and accessible housing by making it easier to develop in the places that we want. And this is important from a housing and a smart growth perspective, but also just thinking generally about climate resilience and adaptation. And this is important, I think, for many of the pieces here, that what we are talking about broadly is continued disruptions. And so having housing secure residents, that is only going to build our greater community resilience to climate and other natural hazards and disasters that we're going to be facing. Similarly, economic stability. This is from both a business perspective and a municipality perspective. On the business side, we know that businesses that are located in smart growth areas where folks can walk to during work or after school often are better off financially because they also have that community connection. And from a municipal standpoint, and this is also connected to a later point that I have, but having more compact development is actually a way to increase tax revenues for that town, but it also means that they don't have to spend or waste money on infrastructure such as extending sewer and water lines, roads out into dispersed areas, which they then have to pay for the maintenance for. And again, when we think about what are the impacts of climate, that's destroyed bridges, roads, and other infrastructure pieces. So that's only going to cost municipalities and taxpayers more and more as those storms and other impacts are happening. So we want to set up the economy to be as strong and resilient as possible. Sustainable transportation, so encouraging and supporting more transportation options that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce wear on our roads and infrastructure is so critical. We know that transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. So this is huge. And we have so many ways. I talked about this a little bit earlier on. And I think that in Vermont, because of our rural geography, we often think that cars are a necessity, that it's too difficult to do other types of transportation. People need a car to get from one place to another. And I think we really need to kind of snap out of that idea and start looking at some of the alternatives and put our money into those alternatives, because they do require investment, and they also require us to get out of our cars. And so that's a really important piece here from a greenhouse gas perspective. Social connectedness is something that I think maybe others feel differently, but I think doesn't get talked enough about. Again, having more compact towns and villages means that we have stronger social networks and support services. It helps to reduce isolation, again, really important for elderly folks. Helps to strengthen local networks, including those networks with businesses, getting food out to people, all these things that we saw come through with the pandemic, improving access to health services, and so on. Also with Irene, we saw the communication networks as something that was so important to people's immediate well-being and also longer-term ability to bounce back. And then my final point here is infrastructure resilience. So increased density allows for more efficient and resilient infrastructure, including energy supply systems. And it also improves government's ability to respond to hazards. So again, if we have broken bridges out in the middle of nowhere, it's really difficult for municipalities, especially smaller towns, to be able to respond quickly to those. And the more that those natural disasters happen and impact our infrastructure, the more and more difficult it will be for municipalities to be able to respond adequately to those challenges. So, what does the climate action plan say about smart growth? I have to say, I was personally very pleased that they called very strongly for the support of compact development and compact settlement patterns as a major need to address climate resilience and adaptation. And what the climate action plan actually says is that we need to support, and I'm reading from my notes here, that we need to support compact settlement patterns, quote, that contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, enhance community and built environment resilience, and help conserve natural and working lands. And so there's three main strategies that the climate action plan highlights here. And these are all things that the NRC has been working on for many years and we very much support. We don't agree with every single point and suggestion that was in the plan, but we agree with most of it. And it's really exciting to be able to have this platform in recognition of the importance of smart growth and land use from a climate perspective. So the first strategy here, and there's a lot of detail in the plan, and I would encourage you to go and read it if you haven't already. So I'm just going to kind of touch on highlights here. But the first strategy is increasing investment in infrastructure. And so this is everything from water and wastewater to active transportation, so sidewalks and bike lanes, but also broadband and things like that. We are really interested in using incoming federal dollars to invest in water and wastewater infrastructure as a really key part to being able to support compact development here. The second strategy is updating governance and regulations across from local to state government here. And there's several pieces of policy that we're going to be working on in this session to address this piece. One I'll mention is doing a broader assessment of our state's designation programs, which help to support designated towns and villages with financial and technical support. But we want to just look at the programs that we already have and make sure that we're doing them in the most effective and efficient way possible. And then finally, the third strategy here is funding research and updating mapping, which is really important for land use work. Actually, one action here that the climate action plan lists out, though I could name several others that we should do, is conducting a study that can actually quantify the impact of smart growth development on greenhouse gas emissions from a vehicle miles traveled standpoint. So if you live in a smart growth area or work in a smart growth area, to what extent is that reducing your emissions versus a sprawl or dispersed area? So that's all of me talking at you for now, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. John and I are going to have a little bit of a conversation, and again, we welcome you to add any questions or thoughts that you have into the chat box, and we would be happy to answer them.
Great, thanks, Katie. That was a great overview. So I'm going to start off by asking Katie a couple of questions. We'll have a conversation and we'll incorporate questions that you have along the way. So Katie, you talked about, define smart growth, talked about how it's not a new idea. And it's something that Vermont has been pursuing as a policy for decades, as you noted. It's reflected not just in Act 250, but actually, the way I read the statutes in all our planning statutes really have strong smart growth goals, even if there's not always implementation provisions to make them happen exactly. Given how the long-standing smart growth policy, imprint in Vermont, why do you think we haven't seen more progress towards, making our communities more livable and sustainable? I know you didn't want to dwell on it, but we've seen, significant sprawl development over the last 40, 50 years. And what are the obstacles to now with climate, change and needing to address this threat to being more effective in putting these policies in place?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think that two things that are related. The first is that development generally happens where it's cheaper. So especially if you are a developer, a for-profit company, it can be cheaper to go and build out in a field somewhere rather than closer to a downtown area. And part of that is because a lot of our towns, especially smaller towns, more rural areas, don't have a lot of existing infrastructure. And so that is a cost issue for developers, where it's going to be more profitable for them to build a subdivision of single family homes with septic out in a field versus having to also deal with water and wastewater capacity in a downtown location where they won't be able to build as many units. And part of that has been a zoning constraints. That's something that over the past couple of years, I think a lot of towns and planners and the state has recognized as a big barrier to developing in downtown areas, especially in relation to housing, where we've set up zones to be so specific that you can only build housing and you can only build single family homes in specific areas, and we can't have homes right next to a business, and there's all these requirements and so on. So there is a process right now that the state is helping municipalities to reform and update their bylaws that should help with some of those zoning concerns. But I think that one of the biggest issues, just in terms of money and the impact that it would ultimately have, is water and wastewater infrastructure in our downtowns and villages. Because again, it's a cost issue, but it's also a land issue. And so if a smart growth area doesn't have that infrastructure in place, that means that any new development in that area, if we want to do infill, in that area, they're going to have to deal with water and wastewater, put in a septic system in that area, which requires a certain amount of land that might not be available, or might not, be able to make the numbers work in that limited space that they're given. So it's really a barrier to infill development in those locations, and it's just an extremely expensive process that needs to happen. And so the state has programs that are able to support municipalities in expanding or updating or developing their water and wastewater systems in downtown areas. But we've also seen that state spending on these things has actually decreased in recent years. This is one of the findings of our recently released progress report on smart growth, which looks at state spending. And so this is something that the state could also be helping with, providing funding support and guidance and technical support for municipalities to increase their water and wastewater capacity and infrastructure.
So maybe it's a good time just to let people know who are on the webinar, that, because of all the COVID money, because of the infrastructure money coming from the federal government and some of the COVID relief funds, there is money now to upgrade water and wastewater systems in downtown areas, and to even actually construct systems to serve some of the areas that don't have wastewater capacity now that Katie mentioned. So that's an issue I would encourage people to follow in the legislature. And as the budget gets reviewed in the legislature, VNRC and a number of other groups, we want to try to take advantage of this influx of money to address some of the issues that Katie mentioned. And also, and I don't know, Katie, if you could update kind of where this is at, but for people in their own communities that want to update the bylaws to deal with some of the constraints that you mentioned, there's been for a couple of years, right, this bylaw modernization grant, right?
Yep, so that's a relatively new program, but that provides funding for municipalities to update their bylaws. The state has also worked to create guides. So there's a relatively new guide called Zoning for Great Neighborhoods that also provides some really specific recommendations for how to update your zoning and bylaws to address these specific concerns. So yeah, there's a lot of really fantastic support that's out there, and we're advocating to continue supporting and increasing funding for these programs, so that municipalities have the support that they need in order to achieve these reforms.
Great. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the housing issue that's everybody's heard about and experiencing in Vermont. And there's definitely in communities a shortage of housing. Real estate values have gone up significantly since COVID, and with in-migration of people that we're seeing with money to basically buy property and drive up prices. There are a number of bills in the legislature to deal with these issues, but I wonder if you could just comment on one of the issues that we're dealing with as we go into the legislature is it's sort of an assumption that land use regulations and policy is an obstacle, is really a main cause of the housing issue. From your perspective, could you just describe what you think the kind of the housing issue is that we need to deal with, and what role is land use playing, in it, as opposed to other issues?
Yeah, so housing is an incredibly complicated issue, but it's not that hard to see, I think, what some of the main drivers of the challenge are. And I'll say that I have experience in working to try and implement housing and affordable housing at the local level. So a lot of my thoughts come from that personal experience. The housing crisis is not a Vermont issue, right? This is a crisis across the country. So while there are some arguments that land use regulations such as Act 250 cause a significant barrier for housing development in the state of Vermont, we've not only heard from developers who have said that that's not really the case, but also we know that there are much more significant barriers to housing development in Vermont, and that are also faced across the country. These are everything from cost of labor and supplies. As some of you might know, Vermont is actually at the end of the supply chain. So it is actually more expensive in Vermont to build just because of that very fact. Also that we have a smaller population, so we have a more limited supply of workers. Now we're in this kind of terrible circle where we also don't have housing for the folks who would be building housing. So that's something that we need to try and get out of. I mentioned earlier the impact of zoning and zoning for single family homes. That is a relic of I'll say a bad time in planning and zoning that we are getting out of, but that's also something that has been in our regulations for long enough that most of us, that's what we're used to, right? Is having neighborhoods generally of single family homes. And then we have downtown, more commercial areas. Maybe there's apartments there too, but generally these uses are kept separate. And so now as we're moving into communities and saying, hey, we should really actually mix these uses up a little bit more, build more housing in commercial areas and so on and so forth. There's also an issue that we do come across, which is the NIMBY, or not in my backyard. So people who don't want to see their communities change. We don't want a 4-story building in our historic downtown. Concerns like that, some of which are totally legitimate. And there are processes, and this is partly what a good town plan and community engagement is for, to make sure that any development in those places where people who live there feel a strong sense of place and connection to that area. We don't want to turn it into a place that you totally don't recognize. At the same time, there are plenty of ways to increase housing in development in those areas. And just going back to John's question about the barriers that we face there. So zoning, cost are two big ones. We also know that there are kind of, I don't want to say innovative because they've been around forever, but solutions like creating ADUs, accessory dwelling units, or granny flats. There's a million different names for them, but essentially the idea of adding on a small unit to an existing home. This is not the silver bullet for solving our housing crisis by any means, but it's just an example of ways that we can be adding housing units fairly quickly in communities. And the best part about it is that they just kind of blend in, but even ADUs have needed zoning changes and community support. So just making sure that the community is on board and actively working with the planning commission, decision makers, to make sure that all types of housing are allowed uses and allowed to be developed is really important.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to people. I mean, this is an issue that I think you could take action on at the local level, get involved with your planning commission, look at your bylaws, see if you want to pursue a grant with the state to get, a consultant help in dealing with some of the complex technical issues. So I'm just going to ask a couple other questions because I see a lot of questions in the chat and I want to make sure people have time. But I do want to, it's a question and sort of a comment. I do want to alert people to the bills that are in the legislature. There are 3 or 4 at least housing bills in the legislature right now that deal with some of the economic issues that Katie just talked about, that also deal with some of the land use issues in terms of the zoning restrictions, and also that deal with Act 250. And you should really follow these bills closely. They're in Senate Economic Development. There's a couple of bills in House Natural Resources. Representative Bargartz has a bill. And in Senate Natural Resources, Senator Bray and Senator McCormick both have bills that address Act 250 and how it would regulate, like how housing development in the designated areas that Katie mentioned would be reviewed under Act 250, and also protect forest land and working lands better. Act 250, you can go on VNRC's website, you can look this up, we've written about it a lot, but Act 250 has not done a great job protecting forest land and working lands. Act 250 applies only to about 7% of residential development, less than 10% in the state. And there have been real documented effects, especially in areas without zoning and subdivision regulations, of real impacts to our forest resources in particular. And so there are bills that kind of deal with how do we encourage development through zoning and Act 250 in these designated areas, as Katie said. What are these designated? What do you have to do to get this designation? What are the criteria? What is the process? These programs need updating. So that's just things to look for. I don't know, Katie, if you want to comment on any of the housing bills, on either the bills dealing with what are known as priority housing projects in Act 250, or some of the zoning changes, or any of the other Act 250 issues that are
Sure,
before the
yeah.
legislature.
So in terms of the priority housing project, so John just touched on this a little bit, but essentially these are housing projects that are being built in designated downtowns, also other designated areas. So these are smart growth locations. These are the places that we want to build housing. There currently in some of this policy, there are certain proposals to expand the ability to be considered a priority housing project and get the benefit of a priority housing project, which is to have Act 250 waived from those projects. So they don't need to go through that permitting process. We agree that we want to support housing in these areas, make it a more streamlined process, reduce redundancies and so on. At the same time, we feel very strongly that towns also need to have the appropriate zoning and staff capacity for enforcement and implementation, to make sure that we aren't just saying, sure, you can build here, and we're not gonna, we don't want to close any eyes to that type of development, and make sure that those towns still have the appropriate environmental regulations in place. So that's something that we are keeping an eye on and making sure is continuing to be a part of the conversation. Is yes, let's talk about how we can make it easier to build in these places, especially priority housing projects is one way to do it. There are other potential ways to make it easier as well. And those are some of the bills that John just mentioned, that particularly in the Senate Natural Resources Committee. So our ultimate goal is to make sure that we can make it easier to develop housing, to do infill development in these areas, but also making sure that towns have the appropriate measures, and again, local staff in place, which can be difficult for smaller towns that don't have zoning, is a kind of separate, larger concern. But that's a big focus of ours in the conversations moving forward for the priority housing projects and their relation to Act 250. But I'd just say that there are other ways to support housing that we should be focused on. We are focused on, and other housing partners are also looking at this year in the legislature. That includes funding to help bring rental units back online and provide money for landlords to rehab their rental units, supporting the development again of ADUs and other missing middle or infill housing in that way. One of the bills that we're working on would extend the timeline for municipal permits for builders. So if something like a COVID happens and all the materials that you were expecting to come within 3 months gets delayed for a year, you have a little bit more time to get through that process without having to start all over again. We also think that it's really important to fully fund Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. They are a really incredibly important partner for building affordable housing and building it in smart growth locations, and unfortunately have been funded under their statutory level for many, many years. And so that's an established organization that has done fantastic work, and we would like to see fund at a higher level.
Right, so lots of questions in the chat. We'll get to those now. I will list the bills while Katie does a speed answering of questions. It's going to be an incredible feat to watch. I'll go look up. I know some of the bill numbers off the top of my head, but not all of them. So I'll look them up. I'll put them in the chat. And I know, Sheldon, if you want to kind of pull out some of the questions and start, we can start with those.
Yes. So one of our first questions is, what is the role of transportation options for rural populations in Vermont? Could you talk a little bit more about that and what you had in mind when you mentioned that?
Yes, great question. And I love it because I love talking about transportation in Vermont, because it is really challenging, but I also think at the same time, there's a lot of really fantastic opportunities. And I'll say that one of my roles is helping to facilitate a coalition of partners across the state called Transportation for Vermonters. And this is looking at transportation, not just from an environmental and a climate perspective, but also a health and safety and access perspective. So that has a group that I really enjoy working with and hearing their perspectives on this issue, because they bring so many really fantastic ideas. So one example of a project that I'll give two quick examples. The first, in Montpelier, there is a project that was launched last year called My Ride, which is a micro transit pilot project. So essentially, the idea there is, because we have smaller populations, this is a new way to serve the transit needs of those populations by having a little bit more of kind of an Uber model. So this is on-demand transit. You have smaller vehicles. Somebody calls in and says, I need a ride from here to here, and then those vehicles are able to move people around. It's less of the traditional fixed route type of transit service. So it's aiming to be a bit more flexible. There's still working through how this works for the community. The idea being partly that different communities, especially in Vermont, we have different population sizes, different geographic layouts and needs. And so we're trying to find a little bit more of a flexible option. To give an example from a smaller town, in the Mad River Valley, a community group. So the My Ride project in Montpelier was really supported by a group of volunteers there, but it was also run by Green Mountain Transit, which was their transit provider. The Mad River Valley project, also led by a group of volunteers, did not have support from Green Mountain Transit, although they were involved in conversations. But it was the senior center in Waitsfield that really made this project happen, which was a single, it started as a single vehicle that they purchased, and then offered rides for folks who needed a ride to health services, to the grocery store, to run errands, whatever it was. And that has been an incredibly successful model in increasing access to transportation for that population. I think that one of the bigger missing pieces that will be a bit more challenging to work towards is the commuter population. And that is something that again, because of our lacking density, creates a little bit more of a challenge, but the state still does have some really fantastic programs to help with carpooling, so connecting employees to drive together to different places. And one of the major pieces that we're looking at right now in terms of transportation moving forward is what's called transportation demand management, which generally includes different types of mobility and transportation. But ultimately, the idea is that a business can implement a transportation demand management plan for their employees. And so if we can encourage them to do that, this would be a plan that would say, hey, there's 2 carpools coming back and forth between Burlington and Montpelier, and we're also going to incentivize you with a bonus if you take the bus back and forth, and if you're riding your bike here, you get a free meal at wherever. But the idea is that we are utilizing all of the different transportation sources that we have and trying to make them work and incentivizing people, in this case, specifically employers and employees, to kind of make the network work. Hope that answers the question. I could talk about that forever, so I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. I'll try to combine some of the questions so we can get to as many as possible. It seems like a lot of the questions have to do with kind of the culture, dealing with the cultural issues related to smart growth and kind of the pushback between kind of towns not wanting infill development and the idea that folks don't want a lot of new people moving to their town. How do we kind of deal with like more of the cultural issues related to smart growth? And how do we kind of build a story around the necessity for smart growth in our community centers?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that last point that you just brought up about how do we tell the story of smart growth is something that's really, really important, and something that I'm focused on trying to communicate better to folks. I think that on the one hand, we can recognize that we have 2 big groups of people who actually do want to be living in more concentrated areas in our downtowns and our villages. That's, as I mentioned before, younger people and also older people. And part of that is the ability for folks to age in place and stay not necessarily in their previous homes, but at least stay in their communities by downsizing and finding a more appropriate space for them. And so we actually do have a lot of folks, our neighbors, our friends, our family, maybe ourselves, who want to live in these areas. And I think that as we continue to see our older neighbors age and want to stay, but not necessarily stay in their larger home, and we want to have our kids or our friends come and live in our towns, but they want to live in denser areas. I think that culture shift will start to happen by itself. And in the other way that I think it will start to happen by itself, but can be furthered and maybe brought into the broader conversation, hopefully in a more positive light, because from a slightly more negative perspective, we're going to start to see, and we already have started to see, the change happening, as I talked a little bit about before earlier, and I think John mentioned as well, with folks who are moving into the state at this point from COVID, and also from climate, and we expect to continue to happen from climate change. We know that Vermont is a place that people want to be moving to. It's safer. It's relatively can be cheaper than other states and so on. So these are people who are moving into the state because they can afford to, which means that they can also afford, I'm sure I don't need to tell you the stories about out-of-state folks who are coming in and buying up a house, offering $30,000 over asking price, sight unseen, and people who have lived here and are trying to buy their first home or any home, or even a rental, can't find anything, and prices are going through the roof. We're also, something that VNRC in particular is keeping an eye on, as we're able to receive more data, is the extent to which these newcomers are also building new homes out in more dispersed areas that we would prefer not to see development, that might be causing forest fragmentation and other environmental issues that we don't want to see. So my point is that change is happening quickly, and it's going to continue happening. And so we have a choice, as we did in the 60s and 70s and before then, whether or not we want to take action, and sometimes that means tough choices to manage that change, or we don't, essentially, and that will lead to, I think, more negative consequences than we would all of us would prefer. So I totally understand a lot of the concerns and feel them myself, but I think that it's important for us to remember, and as we're telling the story about why smart growth is important, that we remember that change is happening. It's going to happen in the form of either a changed, slightly denser, maybe a little bit taller, maybe a little bit more crowded downtown, or it's going to happen in the form of more environmental destruction, congestion, and traffic along our highways and so on.
Thank you. So very quickly before we close, could you, in like 30 seconds, give us like a couple more examples of where you see kind of like smart growth happening around the state?
Oh boy, yeah. So I think that there's a lot of really great examples, and I don't. Oh geez, I don't want to pull out specific towns just because there are so many really fantastic examples, and instead I'll just say, if you look at some of the programs that are being offered by the state to support towns in their smart growth development, you can find a lot of really fantastic examples of what those look like. And if you want more specific examples, please feel free to email me. But the municipal planning grant program with the state, the downtown transportation fund, the Better Places and Better, which is new and better connections. These are all funding programs through the state that help smart growth areas to do things like create better downtown infrastructure, to enhance certain buildings or projects, create more vibrant and livable communities. And there's a lot of really fantastic examples on those websites, which I'm happy to, share, email me, but we can share them later. Really great examples of different ways that towns have started to and are working towards more and more smart growth projects. And I'll also just end with, and I appreciate everybody who's staying past our time here, that VNRC helps to facilitate a really fantastic grant program called Small Grants for Smart Growth. And these are relatively small grants that are really fantastic seed funding for any ideas or kind of catalyzing projects that communities have for helping to develop more affordable housing, sustainable transportation options, all of the things that we've talked about today. And as your communities are thinking about how to use incoming ARPA and federal funding that's coming in, this is a really great opportunity to bring that community conversation together, to tell the story of why it's important that smart growth is being prioritized here. So I would really encourage everybody to look at that grant program from BNRC and also from the state to look at different examples. But I'll leave it there because I know that I've been rambling for long enough.
So Colin put in the chat a link to that, just so
Thank
people
you,
can
Colin.
see. And there were a lot of great questions. So maybe Sheldon, could we hold on to those questions and
Mhm.
I don't know, try to answer as many as we can on our website, or like so people could get those answers at a different time, because I was really great participation in questions. We just in an hour we can't answer them all.
Yes, will do. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, John. Look out for more emails from BNRC and BCV about more webinars to come. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.